Hi, it's Jennifer Hicks with Purpose Planning. Hope you're doing well. I sound awful, feel fine. Today I want to introduce a video that is very different than what we've done in the past. We didn't intend it for it to be this way, but we like to do interviews, especially with our team. And Dusty has been with the Federal Reserve prior to coming into the investment business. So we thought we'd pick his brain back in April. And so we discussed and asked questions that tie in the Fed, interest rates, inflation, market volatility, the Ukraine, the world markets. And it's all intertwined. And that's kind of why this is not a short video. This will take 10, 15 minutes of your time. We completely understand if you don't have time to watch it, but if you do and you want some good education, this is the way to do it. And then if there's more questions, please feel free to give us a call. We hope you enjoy. We don't do this very often, but this information is good and relevant. Hope you're having a great day. Dusty, tell us how you view the Fed as an advisor.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's completely different than how I viewed it when I worked there. For many reasons, one of which is the Fed is much bigger than what market pundits, market researchers, economists that are looking to publicize things talk about the Fed. They talk specifically about one aspect, which is economic policy, monetary policy, interest rates.
Okay.
Well, the Fed does a whole lot more than that. And so it's interesting as an advisor and in working with clients, focusing on that aspect that is the aspect that does the most to the stock market and the bond market and has the most effects in that regard, but completely different than the Fed and supervises banks and ensures that banks have a good balance sheet in place so that we're comfortable with the banking structure in the United States. They also provide services to banks. As an example, one of the key things that we focus on from a market standpoint is interest rate, the interest rate that they set. Well, that interest rate is the overnight lending rate between banks. So it affects all other interest rates, but all other interest rates are working off of that as well as supply and demand, just like all economic conditions.
That's the rate we hear when the Fed is raising it a quarter or a half. It's that base rate that then all the other interest rates are adjusted to.
Correct. They're correlated to. But it's not the interest rate that they're affecting is the overnight lending between banks. And all the other interest rates then based on supply and demand conditions and what that baseline rate is are adjusting based on that.
Okay. And just, as a side note, they raised the Fed fund rate last month a quarter. And just yesterday, I saw that mortgage interest rates hit 5%, first time in, I think it was 12 or 15 years. So how is that correlated? Because that's what we all care about.
Yep. So that gets to the supply and demand considerations. And that goes into the bond market in some ways acts a lot like the stock market in that it's trying to price in future considerations. So a lot of what we've seen in the bond market is trying to price in how many interest rates are going to happen and where is the end result of a stable interest rate environment. So they're trying to predict what the Fed's going to do in the future, which is a difficult thing to do because the Fed is historically and more recently is trying to help with guiding that with their dot plot plans on when they came out in March with their quarter interest rate hike. They communicated, here's our plan for the next 2 years. But they're going to react to the data each time they meet. The 8 times they meet every year, they're going to react to that data. They're not just going to make a decision because they said they were going to 2 months ago. They're going to get that economic data from each of their 12 districts that represent the full United States and say, here's what's going on. And then the current voters are going to vote based on that, on what that next change is going to be, both interest rates as well as their participation in the bond market.
So that's why the rate last month might have surprised a few people because we actually thought it was going to come maybe a little later in the year. But now that it's come, and this is my understanding, they're now saying this is what we want to do. But if I heard you correctly, that's what they want to do. But based on their information, maybe what's going on in the world, All these other factors, are they part of that decision when they meet? When is their next meeting, by the way? Is it every month? Because you said 8 times a year.
It's 8 times a year. So the next one's actually in May. And so the structure of their setup is that they have a balance of all of the districts of the United States. So they have 12 districts.
Okay.
Kansas City Fed is one of them, which encompasses Denver, Omaha, and Oklahoma City are the branches of the Kansas City Fed. So that gives you a frame of reference on the part of the United States that the Kansas City Fed covers. There's a St. Louis Fed, a Chicago Fed, a Dallas Fed from a Midwest standpoint.
Okay.
And then there's also West Coast, San Francisco Fed is on the West Coast side of it, and then several on the East Coast. But when they get together for their meetings, each district is bringing to the table their district's economic conditions. So different than maybe some structures or questions that may come up on, well, this is a big city policy or whatnot. They're taking all of that into effect, and they rotate out of those 12 districts. 7 of the district presidents are voting every time.
Okay.
And they rotate that annually.
Okay.
Except for the New York Fed. The New York Fed president gets to vote every time.
And
so it's an interesting structure that the environment is to create information sharing and knowledge across all of the economic conditions in the United States, not just certain parts of the industry or the big banks or get too focused in certain areas.
Okay. So it's almost like they take a little piece of all the different areas, all 12 areas, and then other than the New York, they all get to have a say-so at some point in time. As far as, I shouldn't say a say-so, they all get a vote at some point in time to kind of bring a consensus on how the Fed should be reacting.
Correct. So in addition to the 12 districts, there's a board of governors that's in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
They are appointed from a government standpoint, but they're not government employees, just like the Federal Reserve districts aren't. So they report to Congress, but they don't. The intent of that is to not have political bias in their decision making. Now, they're economists, most of them are economists or have that background, and so they're going to have their slant on their preference on economic policies, but the concept and the goal is to react to the economic data that each district is bringing to the table. And each district gets to bring that every meeting. It's just that only some of them get to vote
on what the reaction or the action will be.
Correct.
Got it. How that experience, and from the financial advisor standpoint, how does that information and what the Fed's doing impact our portfolio decisions, impact our client conversations, impact what we're doing on a day-to-day basis now that we're aware that the Fed has a plan, may not stick to it, but now that they have a plan, how do we take that information and work with it?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is, from working at the Fed and understanding the structure, they are some of the smartest people you could ever know, and the most dedicated. They work really hard and are very educated and smart at what they do. The second piece of that, how it correlates to us, is they're focused on economic conditions. They're not focused on the stock and the bond market, they're focused on economic conditions.
Okay.
So my confidence in them is that they're making decisions when it comes to interest rates and bond buying and bond selling, which is the 2 main ways that it affects us in portfolios. They're making those decisions knowing and based on the economic data that the economy can handle it, whether that's accommodative, which is what they did as part of the response to COVID, when the U.S. economy was shut down, and depending on part of the U.S. that you lived in, it was different levels of shutdown. But that structure put into place, hey, we know there's a challenge in the economy, and that's when they became super accommodative, from 2 to 2.5% interest rates in that range to 0 within 3 weeks. And then implemented a strong structure of buying bonds. They've started to reduce both of those, both the interest rate accommodation, so raising interest rates, as well as becoming more hawkish, is how they describe it, with their bond involvement, which is reducing their involvement in the bond market. So they create an environment in the bond market where if they're buying bonds, they're helping the bond market. If they're reducing their impact in the bond market, by selling or removing offering bonds. They're minimizing that semi-government entity involvement, and then it's running more focused on trading within general trading of consumers and individuals. So that structure provides that from a portfolio decision standpoint. I'm confident that when they're in a process like they are now, where they're becoming more hawkish in taking some of the easy quantitative policy in place, is that they believe their numbers are saying that the economy can withstand this. And that's part of the reason why you'll see some market researchers and pundits that aren't making these decisions, but are out there for different reasons, getting people to read their articles and those considerations.
Watch
that
the
will
shows.
say, so they're out there trying. Some of those will say, well, they should just rip the Band-Aid off and raise interest rates back up to the 2 to 2.25 or that range. And it's that structure of, that's easy for them to say because they're not making those decisions.
Right.
Now they're smart people and are doing the analysis, but the Fed is evaluating that on what do they believe the economy can stand?
What the economy can stand. And if I heard you correctly, which, if I was a client and I heard that, I would say, well, then the economy is in a position where it can handle interest rate hike. The economy is strong enough in the position it's in to continue to see those interest rate hikes. And for me as an advisor, I'm thinking, yay, because that's what I want to hear is the economy is in a position and is strong enough and looking forward enough that interest rate hikes are not going to be detrimental and actually will be beneficial, because we know that interest rate hikes help bring inflation down and kind of slow some of that economic expansion that's maybe been a little bit out of control. Would that be a fair thought or statement?
Yeah, so yes. At the end of the day, the markets, both the stock and the bond market, are not the economy. The economy is completely different. Now the stock and the bond market are trying to price in the economy and future considerations with the economy.
But that's how we as investors invest or benefit from the economy, is by buying our stocks or our bonds.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. And so you've hit that exactly. So what they've communicated and what all of the economic data would say is, for the Fed, one of their goals is a stable economy. A stable economy is often defined, there's many factors to that, but two of the most major are low inflation, low unemployment. Well, as we may recall, with COVID reaction, the initial reaction to COVID, unemployment skyrocketed. And inflation, well, we were going negative for a while, so we weren't worried about inflation from a growth standpoint in the United States because everything was shutting down. So hence the accommodative policy. Well, now shifting that gear, which is what they're doing, is unemployment numbers are still great. Unemployment is back to being low. A whole bunch of the other economic data is still very strong. The one number that is the most cautioned is the inflation number being high. And part of the reason that their adjustments this year in their research was initially some of that inflation, the term they used was transitory.
Right.
Which was, we think it's going to be short term. It's related to pandemic shutdowns in the U.S., overseas.
Shortage, we have money to spend, we can't buy what we want.
Correct. And so they thought that was going to be transitory, and the research was saying ideally less shutdowns would result in less transitory. But it's been here for a while, and we've had other conditions like Russia, Ukraine that have caused additional inflation in the short term here. That some of their policy decisions are both to get back to more standard normal policy and to combat inflation.
Actions in the world, especially in Ukraine, and the ripple effect it's having through Europe, how will that impact the Fed's meeting and decisions? Because we are a world economy. We might think that the U.S. is the end-all be-all, but we are the world. There is a world economy, and everything is somewhat connected. So how is that going to impact their next meeting and decision?
Yeah, good question. So I'm going to go back to the structure of the Fed with their 12 districts, and by separating those districts across the United States, certain districts are more impacted by world events than others. So as an example, I'll go back to kind of that Midwest corridor that we're mostly in.
Right.
And we have less effect than some of the coast, the San Francisco Fed and what they're experiencing, the East Coast banks and what they're experiencing. And so what the Fed is focused on is, again, those districts are going to bring that data to the table, as it's affecting their district, as well as it could affect the Kansas City Fed. So all of those considerations are going to be factored in. The biggest effect is going to be economic conditions specific to the United States. So how does Russia, Ukraine, and mainly from that standpoint, more Russia than Ukraine in this example, on what resources do they provide to the world, and how is that affecting the U.S. economy, and how is that affecting all of the developed market economies across the globe?
So as we provide sanctions to Russia and implement sanctions across many countries, those resources are going to have to be obtained from other areas, which could have a positive or a negative impact on the U.S. economy, and that's how that is going to be factored into that decision.
Correct.
Okay. Yep. Okay. With what they said in March, they raised interest rates. And now I'm going to ask you to be a pundit, how likely will they surprise us? So, I've listened to bond managers and bond experts, and they like that 0.25% rise, 0.25%. How likely is it they're going to swing out and go, ooh, we were off a little bit, we're going to raise it 50 or 75 bips, 0.5% or 0.75%? How likely is that, and how would they convey that to soften the blow?
Yeah, so you've seen some of that in the reaction of the bond market since the last interest rate hike. So they announced that interest rate hike in March and then announced their plan going forward, which, for lack of better terms, it was a whole bunch of quarter rate hikes. And initial reaction from the bond market was positive. The bond market turned better for a little bit. And then the Powell, the Fed governor, and then several of the Fed presidents have had speeches since then and have been prepping through their communications that, hey, we're going to react to the data, and there's the possibility that instead of a quarter rate hike, it'll be a 0.5% rate hike. So they're already trying to, and this is something they've learned from the past, they're trying to convey, this is what our initial plan was, but we don't want to surprise anything. We want everything to be known that here's the options. Okay,
Dusty, I learned something today. I am very happy that we are all on the same team here, working with our clients and helping them out with their investment decisions. So if you have a question for Dusty, just give him a call. Don't call me. No, I'm just joking. If you have a question, give us a call here at Purpose Planning. Stevie's here, Dusty's here, I'm here, and we have our whole team that can help you out with any questions you might have, either on your own portfolio or on what's going on with the Fed.